The Western world has a bit of a reputation of being, well, obsessed with ourselves. Our lens on history tends to be a bit limited to our own, and it can be hard to imagine that there are even two sides to the globe. And yes, that sadly extends to our knowledge of film history. That's a real shame because when it comes to cinematic histories, Japan is one of the most fascinating in the world. From the classic works of filmmakers like Kurosawa and Ozu, who laid down the foundations for the future of cinema, filmmakers of the Japanese New Wave like Oshima and Teshigara, who rejected tradition in favor of experimentation and reflecting inwards, to even the genre of Yakuza films popular in the late 20th century. Japan has become one of the most important nations for cinema, and yet despite all that history, Japan's modern-day influence on the film community is often limited to its animation scene, which sure, is fantastic, but it's sad to see so little outside of it. That said, there are a few bright, shining faces in the live-action field. Takashi Miike and Sion Sono, for example, have been two of the most vivid, experimental, and just completely fucking bonkers directors out there. But today, we're going to be focusing on another big name in Japanese live-action cinema right now, Hirokazu Kore-eda. He may not be the flashiest of the three, but Kore-eda has made a name for himself by making films with a subtle, beautiful touch. His focus on wide, still long takes and stories on family issues in Japan have led him to being known as this generation's Ozu. And seeing his best work, it's not too hard to see why. The beauty and depth to his films is immobilizing, and with his work, it's hard to simply not look on in awe. But with this film comes his first venture outside of Japan, as he attempts to make his first Western film. And with this came both intrigue and skepticism. See, I've always loved watching directors' first steps outside their country of origin. It can be fascinating to see how their approach changes, but it can also spell trouble for someone like Kore-eda, who makes films with themes so intrinsically tied to Japan itself. And with it coming out to so little fanfare, I was cautiously optimistic. He hasn't led us astray in the past, admittedly, but there was still a lingering fear surrounding this. And I hate to say it, but those fears admittedly came a little bit true. To be fair, it's not like this film was bad. Not at all. Just forgettable. And that's kind of the problem. Kore-eda isn't one to make forgettable movies. Slow ones? Maybe. But forgettable entirely? Not at all. It mainly comes down to its plot. More accurately, its real lack of one. Plot is, very simply, a daughter coming back to see her famous actor mother, who was never really around for her as a kid, who has just released her new autobiography called The Truth, which is, ironically, filled with a ton of lies about how she was some great mother. And that is really it. The rest of the film is just conflicts surrounding those two topics. This seems like a decent setup, but all that's left to it is just the conversations about how truth can be different between two people, how what we see as truth can say something about ourselves, and truth in acting. All interesting things, but not really an arc or storyline, just a conversation. And that's really it. This is what I like to call a conversation film. That's to say, the film is more interested in having a conversation on a subject than it really is about actually being entertaining or a well-made film. I covered a film last year called Nonfiction that had a similar issue, but admittedly to a much stronger degree. Link in the card. I mean, it's an interesting conversation, but I mean, we've had films about these issues, and they all have taken the concept and ran with it much more than this. Why simply watch a conversation on it instead when I could see more of a story or a metaphor, anything but simply talking? This isn't to say that the film doesn't have any aspects that fulfill on their potential, at least somewhat. There are scenes, for example, that really play on this and present what the film could have been. It's actually quite funny when it wants to be in a dry situational way, and the characters are certainly well-rounded. I could describe them really well and uniquely. It just feels like they don't have much to do or accomplish. But when they're on screen, they at least have a very real, tangible energy to them. Speaking of which, the acting is phenomenal. As expected, too. I mean, it's an act-off between Catherine Deneuve and Juliette Binoche, where they play a bickering mother and daughter combo. Two of the greatest actors to ever touch the silver screen, turning in full-fledged performances that feel as real as whatever device you're watching this on. Neither is the best of their career, of course, but average for them is incredible for any other actor. It's so quality that you kind of forget that Ethan Hawke is there, too. And he's doing a solid job himself. It's just hard to compare to the two people he's next to. But even with that, I can't say the film ever goes beyond just being okay. How could it? Plot barely makes an impact. The directing, while occasionally flashy, tends to sadly revert to shot, reverse shot, despite despite him technically wowing with his composition and how he can frame conversations and characters. Even the music doesn't feel very special. It's bouncy and fun, but not in a unique or special way. It feels like I've heard it a million times before. It doesn't at all help that with how plotless this film is, the ending pulls a 180 and just decides to wrap things up way too cleanly, especially with these characters. I mean, it feels like Kore-eda's just writing himself out of a corner here more than anything else. After all, how do you wrap up a story with no arc or stakes? It's a tough one, and it seems Kore-eda sadly opted for the choice of simply changing the point of friction for the characters suddenly and out of nowhere. Sad to say, but Kore-eda's Western debut is pretty bland. It's admittedly still enjoyable with reservations, but those were reservations that I never really had to make for him in the past. Hopefully this blip in his filmography is something he'll overcome in his next film, because this being his legacy in the Western world would be a shame, especially when we ignore Japanese cinema enough as is. Hirokazu Kore-eda's The Truth gets a 6 out of 10.